On the battlefields of the First World War, soldiers faced an overwhelming number of threats that went far beyond the traditional idea of man-to-man combat. Modern technology, artillery, machine guns, tanks, and aviation transformed the battlefield into an industrial mechanism of death, where life and death were often decided by an anonymous bullet or a distant explosion. Trenches, originally intended as protection, became deadly traps due to chemical attacks, barbed wire, flamethrowers, and constant bombardment, while disease, hunger, and psychological collapse destroyed soldiers even when weapons fell silent. In this video, we will look at the ways in which you could lose your life on the battlefields of the First World War. During the First World War, artillery became the most formidable enemy of ground troops and fundamentally influenced all military decision-making, from tactics to strategy. Modernized weapons, new high-explosive ammunition, and extensive artillery preparations created situations in which even the trench position, originally considered a safe shelter, turned into a dangerous trap. One of the most significant advances was the long-recoil gun mechanism, used for example in the French 75mm field gun of 1897. Thanks to it, stable and rapid fire was possible without the need to constantly re-aim the gun, allowing armies to maintain continuous fire pressure. At the beginning of the war, it became clear that traditional shrapnel shells were ineffective against trenches, and therefore high-explosive shells filled with TNT were developed. These shells could tear apart obstacles, barbed wire, and the trenches themselves. At the same time, guns with longer ranges were developed, whether howitzers or heavy siege artillery, capable of destroying fortifications from great distances. Trench warfare itself evolved largely in response to the devastating power of artillery fire. Trenches offered the only possible protection, but with the advent of high-explosive shells, they ceased to be a safe refuge. Artillery concentrations, in which entire batteries fired several shells per minute for hours on end, shattered defenses, and at the same time diverted attention from the true point of attack. The continuous roar and tremors had a destructive effect not only on the body but also on the soldiers' minds. Many suffered from what was known as shell shock, today recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mortars also appeared on the battlefields. German Minenwerfer fired at high angles and made it possible to rain shells directly into enemy trenches. This principle was quickly adopted by other armies. In Great Britain, the light Stokes mortar was mass-produced and widely used from 1915. France developed a heavy 240mm grenade launcher, and Austria-Hungary its own 260mm Minenwerfer. These weapons posed another deadly threat to infantry, as they could destroy positions protected from direct fire. In 1915, an even more terrifying weapon appeared: chemical shells. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas, delivered by artillery rounds, could fill trenches with lethal gas. Soldiers were endangered even where conventional gunfire could not reach them, and without effective protection they were practically condemned to death or severe injury. As the war progressed, artillery tactics also evolved. Whereas early on the focus was mainly on area destruction, later more sophisticated methods emerged, such as the creeping barrage, a rolling curtain of fire that advanced just ahead of the attacking infantry and covered its movement. Defenders responded with defense in depth and counterattacks by reserves hidden beyond the immediate reach of bombardment. Ultimately, artillery became an almost all-powerful instrument of warfare. Trenches, originally built as protection, turned into dangerous traps. Roads and supply lines were constantly threatened by shellfire. Gas shells filled shelters with deadly fumes, and psychological pressure dulled soldiers' will and ability to fight. For most soldiers at the front, the greatest threat was not a bullet or a bayonet, but artillery. The first automatic machine gun was invented by the American-British engineer Hiram S. Maxim in 1884 and became a revolutionary breakthrough in armaments. It operated fully automatically, using the recoil of each fired round to load and fire the next, so that simply pulling the trigger was enough. This principle was unprecedented at the time and immediately changed ideas about how rapidly and effectively fire could be delivered. The Maxim gun had a water-cooled barrel holding about 1 gallon of water and was fed by ammunition belts. It could fire 550 to 600 rounds per minute, which for contemporary infantry meant devastating firepower. Its drawback was weight. The gun itself weighed around 27 kilograms, and with its mount and accessories up to 60 kilograms, so operation required a crew of 4 to 6 men. Maxim sold his invention, and in Britain the weapon was renamed the Vickers gun. The Vickers machine gun was lighter and more reliable than the original Maxim, could fire 450 to 600 rounds per minute, and had a range of up to 4,100 meters. It quickly became the standard weapon of the British Army, and its effectiveness was so great that it later shaped First World War tactics. Germany adopted its own version of the Maxim, creating the Milligram 08, which from 1908 became the main heavy machine gun of the Imperial Army. During the war, the number of these weapons increased dramatically and transformed the battlefield into a deadly line where every burst could mean death. Machine guns also transformed military tactics. The British introduced overhead covering fire, in which bullets passed above the heads of their own troops, allowing attacks to be supported and rapid responses to infantry calls for help. The German army reacted by introducing lighter and more mobile machine guns, enabling elite assault formations and specialized firing units. In practice, machine guns were extraordinarily reliable. For example, the Vickers machine gun was able to fire up to 5 million rounds during a prolonged test without significant wear. According to historical data, artillery fire accounted for roughly 60 to 75% of all combat injuries and deaths, and the second largest cause was fire from small arms, primarily rifles and machine guns, which were responsible for approximately 20 to 35%. Every infantryman carried a standard rifle, such as the British Lee Enfield, the German Gua 98, or the French Lebel, and used it in attacks, in trench defense, and on patrol. In trench warfare conditions, fighting often took place at very short distances. Soldiers fired over the parapet or just a few meters from the enemy. A shot could come at any time, whether during an assault or seemingly quiet sentry duty. Direct fire from machine guns and rifles thus represented a constant threat and significantly contributed to the physical and psychological exhaustion of soldiers. A typical example of the deadly power of the combination of artillery and machine guns is the Battle of the Somme in 1916, when British forces suffered more than 57,000 casualties in a single day. At the start of the First World War in 1914, infantry went into battle with weapons that were fairly standardized across European armies. Rank-and-file soldiers were equipped with bolt-action rifles fitted with bayonets, while officers carried sabers and short firearms, revolvers or pistols. This arsenal was designed for maneuver warfare in open terrain, but with the transition to trench warfare it proved impractical. In the narrow, complex trenches, where short distances, loss of orientation, and chaos dominated, long bayonets and sabers were unsuitable. Rifles with long barrels were awkward to handle in trenches, and shorter carbines proved more practical. Hand grenades also gained great importance. The British Mills bomb and the German steel hand grenade became basic tools of trench combat. Raiding parties intended for night attacks on enemy lines used pistols, light machine guns, flamethrowers, and for support also portable mortars or light infantry guns. At the same time, improvisation and individual adaptation of weapons spread rapidly. Knives became a common part of equipment, whether Army-issued utility tools or specialized weapons such as the American Mark I trench knife. The trench shovel was often sharpened along its edges and turned into an effective cutting weapon. French soldiers reportedly fashioned improvised daggers from metal stakes used for barbed wire, known as the clou français. In addition, a wide range of cold weapons appeared, such as clubs, batons, maces, and cudgels. Brass knuckles were also popular, sometimes combined with a dagger. Soldiers thus supplemented official equipment with a broad array of improvised instruments of death, often made during quieter periods of frontline life. Although popular imagination often associates the First World War with brutal hand-to-hand combat, statistics show that reality was different. More than 90% of casualties were caused by artillery and machine guns, technological means of long-range combat. Direct contact. When a soldier saw the whites of the enemy's eyes, remained relatively rare. Nevertheless, the narrative of close combat deeply influenced military culture and soldier self-perception. During the First World War, new and terrifying weapons appeared on the battlefields that not only killed but also crushed morale. One of them was the flamethrower, used primarily by the German army. They were first deployed on a large scale at Hooge in Belgium in July 1915, where jets of fire hurled into trenches caused panic and retreat among British defenders. The flamethrower attacked not only physically, intense heat burned defenders, fire consumed oxygen in the trenches, and many men suffocated before the flames even reached them. The psychological effect was enormous. The mere sight of an approaching tongue of fire was enough for entire units to lose the will to resist. The Germans used various versions, from the portable Klein Flammenwerfer, operated by 2 soldiers and capable of projecting flames up to 30 meters, to the massive Gross Flammenwerfer, suitable only for static positions. Toward the end of the war, a more modern, lighter, and more reliable version called the Wechselapparat appeared and became the standard. Barbed wire, originally invented for agricultural purposes, became one of the most important and dangerous elements of trench defense during the First World War. It was deployed in layers and tangled obstacles dozens of meters deep and up to about 2 meters high. Its main purpose was not to kill the enemy directly, but to slow, delay, and disorganize attacking infantry in the space between trenches. Soldiers who tried to climb over or cut through the wire often became entangled and turned into easy targets for machine gun and artillery fire. Its advantages were simplicity, low cost, and rapid deployment. Wire could be laid even at night with minimal equipment. As a result, it became an indispensable part of trench lines across the entire Western Front. Defenders often created false gaps through which attackers advanced directly into crossfire. Many soldiers likened scenes of comrades' bodies hanging on the barbs to fish caught in a net. Barbed wire, shrapnel, and shell explosions could easily tear open the abdominal cavity, leading to the protrusion of intestines, one of the most horrifying and painful types of war injury. The First World War became the first conflict in which chemical weapons were used on a massive scale. Although poisonous substances had appeared in warfare before, it was not until 1915 that they were employed extensively. That year, during the Second Battle of Ypres, the German army released a cloud of chlorine gas that caused panic and heavy losses among Allied troops. Soon other chemical agents appeared, especially phosgene and mustard gas. Chlorine gas irritated the eyes, nose, and throat, caused coughing, tearing, and a choking sensation, and at high concentrations led to pulmonary edema and death within minutes or hours. Phosgene was far more dangerous. Its effects often appeared only after several hours and caused inflammation of the lungs and the accumulation of fluid, leading to a slow drowning of the victim. Mustard gas acted slowly but painfully. It irritated the skin, eyes, and respiratory tract, caused blisters, burns, and severe lung damage. Even small amounts of mustard gas could cause temporary blindness, infections, and long-term health consequences, with death often occurring days or weeks later due to complications. Overall, gas attacks caused approximately 90 to 100,000 deaths and more than 1 million injuries. Although these numbers represented only a small fraction of total war casualties, the impact of gas went beyond physical losses. Gas attacks became synonymous with the horrors of trench warfare. Soldiers often feared choking clouds more than artillery fire. There also emerged what was called gas shock, a psychological collapse similar to shell shock. Health consequences varied widely. Most soldiers affected by gas eventually recovered and returned to service, although many suffered lifelong effects. Mortality rates were only in the single-digit percentages, but the use of gas had a lasting impact on morale. Chemical attacks forced armies to develop new types of protective masks, from improvised cloths soaked in chemicals to sophisticated gas masks with filters. The use of chemical weapons violated international law, specifically the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which prohibited the use of asphyxiating or poisonous gases. Nevertheless, All the major belligerent powers employed them during the war. The tragic experiences of 1914 to 1918 eventually led to the adoption of the Geneva Protocol in 1925, which formally banned the use of chemical and biological weapons. The development of tanks during the First World War was a direct response to the stalemate that emerged on the Western Front. Static trench warfare, combined with machine gun fire, artillery, and dense belts of barbed wire, made infantry movement almost impossible and caused enormous losses. Although projects for armored vehicles combining protection, firepower, and cross-country capability already existed before 1914, it was the brutal reality of trench fighting that accelerated their development. Great Britain became the pioneer. In August and September 1915, the first prototype, nicknamed Little Willie, was built at the William Foster and Amp Company factory in Lincolnshire. Although this machine suffered from numerous technical shortcomings, it allowed engineers to test the tracked chassis and overall design. It was followed by a second prototype, Mother, which already featured the characteristic side spans and tracks encircling the entire hull. From this design emerged the first mass-produced tank, the Mark I. For reasons of secrecy, these vehicles were referred to as tanks, supposedly after the steel water containers they resembled. They were first deployed on the 15th of September, 1916 at Flers-Courcelette during the Battle of the Somme. Although only some of the vehicles reached the enemy lines and most broke down, the tanks had a strong psychological effect and confirmed their potential. France pursued its own path and deployed its first armored units in April 1917. Its early models, the Schneider CA-1 and the St. Chamond, were cumbersome and often disappointing, but frontline experience led to the development of the light Renault Foot. This vehicle was revolutionary thanks to its rotating turret, rear-mounted engine, and relative mobility. The Renault Foot proved itself in 1918 and became the blueprint for all modern tanks. In the end, the French produced more than 3,700 of these vehicles, more than all other countries combined. Germany only began developing tanks in response to British and French deployments. By the end of the war, it had produced only 18 units of its own A7V type. This was a stark contrast to the thousands of vehicles fielded by the Allies. Instead, the German army relied more heavily on captured tanks, especially British Mark IVs. The first tanks were mechanically unreliable. They often broke down even while moving to the front, suffered from cooling and steering problems, and their interiors were filled with suffocating exhaust fumes. Nevertheless, some types, such as the British Mark IV or the French Renault Foot, proved effective. The rhomboid shape of British machines allowed them to cross wide trenches and heavily cratered terrain where any other vehicle would have become stuck. Tanks represented a significant mechanical and physical danger on the battlefield. They were heavy, armored, and capable of crushing trenches and wire obstacles, leaving soldiers in open ground with little chance of survival. Their firepower could hit individual soldiers or destroy their cover. In addition, the mechanical unreliability of early tanks posed another risk, as vehicles sometimes exploded or overturned, endangering not only their crews but also nearby units. The First World War was the first major conflict in which aviation played a crucial role. Even before 1914, tethered observation balloons were used to help artillery units aim more accurately, but it was the war itself that brought their widespread deployment. Germany also introduced Zeppelin airships, which carried out reconnaissance missions over the North and Baltic Seas and were used for bombing raids on Britain and positions on the Eastern Front. At the beginning of the war, airplanes were still a novelty, and their role was initially primarily reconnaissance. They replaced traditional cavalry, which could no longer provide sufficient intelligence under conditions of modern firepower. Aerial reconnaissance quickly proved its importance, from observing troop movements to aerial photography, which became invaluable for mapping trench systems and directing artillery fire. Combat experience soon led to the development of specialized aircraft types. Fighters appeared, equipped with synchronized machine guns that allowed pilots to fire through the propeller, bombers designed to attack military and industrial targets, and aircraft adapted for low-level flights over trenches, where they strafed the enemy and supported their own infantry. A separate struggle for air superiority emerged, the so-called air war. Fighter pilots, known as flying aces once they achieved a high number of victories, quickly became media celebrities and were portrayed as modern knights, giving the war a new symbolic dimension. Although aviation did not play a strategically decisive role during the war, its tactical contribution was fundamental. Aircraft enabled more accurate and effective artillery fire, faster transmission of information, and direct support for infantry. Zeppelin raids and bomber attacks did not break the resolve of enemy states, but they pointed the way toward future developments. Aviation began to be seen not only as a means of supporting ground forces, but also as a weapon capable of striking civilian populations and strategic targets. During the First World War, friendly fire, the mistaken firing on one's own troops, represented a deadly risk that was surprisingly common under the chaotic conditions of trench warfare on the Western Front. Such incidents occurred mainly due to the complexity of coordination between fire units, poor communication, and limited visibility in dense smoke, fog, or darkness, when orientation and target identification were extremely difficult. A tragic example is an incident at Verdun on the 8th of May, 1916, when a carelessly lit cooking fire caused an explosion that killed hundreds of German soldiers. Troops had attempted to heat coffee using flammable fuel intended for flamethrowers. This led to a fire that spread among weapons, grenades, and ammunition stored inside the fort. The blaze escalated into a massive explosion and firestorm. As a result, hundreds of German soldiers were killed and many more seriously wounded. In the ensuing chaos, many survivors, blackened with ash, were mistakenly believed to be French colonial troops and were shot by their own comrades. Similarly, during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British artillery struck its own soldiers. Reserves were mistakenly shelled by friendly fire, and stored ammunition exploded, causing heavy losses. In the same battle, a unit of the Durham Light Infantry was hit by Australian artillery fire while occupying German trenches. High-ranking officers were not spared either. Canadian General Malcolm Mercer, the highest-ranking officer of his country to die in the First World War, was mortally wounded, probably by a British shell, during fighting at Mount Sorrel in June 1916. Friendly fire was not limited to land warfare. In 1917, the British submarine HMS G9 mistakenly fired a torpedo at its own destroyer HMS Paisley and, in the ensuing confusion, ran aground itself, with its crew losing their lives. New weapons also posed risks, especially chemical agents. During the Battle of Loos in 1915, a shift in the wind blew a cloud of British chlorine gas back into friendly trenches, causing heavy casualties among the troops who had released it. According to some estimates, friendly fire may have accounted for up to 5% of all French combat losses, approximately 75,000 dead. Individual cases are also well known. The British writer C.S. Lewis, then a young officer, was seriously wounded on the 15th of April, 1918 by short-falling British artillery fire. 2 of his comrades were killed in the incident. Trenches provided some protection against bullets and shrapnel, until artillery bombardment began. Shells could transform carefully constructed defenses into rubble within minutes, their collapsing walls often burying men alive. Those who did not suffocate under tons of earth often found themselves trapped in a landscape of mud. Rain, groundwater, and devastated terrain created conditions in which soldiers literally waded knee-deep in mud. There were frequent cases of men becoming stuck and slowly sinking deeper until they suffocated or drowned before the eyes of their comrades. This horror was especially typical of Flanders, where the landscape was turned into a swamp by the fighting. During the First World War, a mysterious condition appeared among frontline soldiers that later became known as shell shock. The term was used to describe psychological and physical symptoms resulting from constant stress, the noise of artillery fire, and the horrors of trench warfare. Affected men suffered from tremors, dizziness, insomnia, loss of the ability to speak or walk, nightmares, panic attacks, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Because contemporary medicine could not clearly explain the condition, it was viewed ambiguously, sometimes as a physical injury to the brain, other times as a sign of weak will. This lack of understanding had tragic consequences for many soldiers. Instead of receiving help, they were often accused of cowardice or malingering. In the British Army, more than 300 men were executed during the war for desertion or disobedience, many of whom were suffering from severe psychological trauma. This condition not only incapacitated soldiers but also dramatically increased their risk of death, either because they were unable to react in combat and became easy targets for the enemy, or because they were punished by their own army. For some men, psychological collapse also led to suicidal thoughts. Prolonged suffering, combined with stigmatization and lack of understanding, could convince a soldier that the only escape from a hopeless situation was his own death. Although exact statistics do not exist, modern research shows that similar forms of war trauma are associated with a high risk of suicide. Shell shock thus became an invisible enemy of the trenches. It was not caused by shrapnel or bullet, yet it could kill, either indirectly, through failure in combat, or directly, through suicide or military execution. Today it is considered a precursor to the modern diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and a reminder that war destroys not only the body, but also the mind. During the First World War, enemy fire was not the only mortal danger facing soldiers. The trench environment itself, in which they spent months or years, was equally deadly. In constant dampness, mud, and filth, diseases and infections spread rapidly, claiming hundreds of thousands of victims. Particularly devastating was the Spanish flu of 1918, which spread worldwide through overcrowded military camps and troop movements and killed tens of millions of people. In addition, soldiers were threatened by dysentery, typhus, and intestinal infections caused by contaminated water and poor hygiene. The absence of antibiotics meant that even a minor wound could be fatal, an infection or gas gangrene was enough, and the only hope was rapid surgery, often involving amputation. Trenches were not only breeding grounds for bacteria and viruses, but also havens for rats and lice, inseparable companions of soldiers. Rats, attracted by food and the bodies of the dead, multiplied rapidly and also spread disease, gnawed equipment, and destroyed supplies. Military chroniclers mention enormous specimens that showed no fear of humans. Even more persistent, however, were the tiny parasites, lice. Virtually every soldier suffered from them, leading not only to constant itching but also to the spread of trench fever and, on some fronts, typhus. Lice hid in the seams of uniforms and were extremely difficult to eradicate, making infection practically inevitable. Trench fever manifested as severe headaches, muscle fatigue, and sharp pain in the shins. A typical symptom was high fever with a relapsing course that often returned repeatedly. Affected soldiers were usually removed from combat duty for weeks and had to remain in hospitals or rear areas. It is estimated that trench fever affected between 800,000 and 1 million soldiers among the Allies alone, with 20 to 33% of soldiers in some units suffering from this disease. If a soldier spent long hours or days in wet and freezing boots, trench foot could develop, a condition in which the feet swell, blister, become numb, and begin to rot. Blood circulation is impaired because cold and overly tight clothing restrict flow, which can cause gangrene and, in severe cases, lead to amputation. During the winter of 1914-15, more than 20,000 cases were recorded among British soldiers. Overall, around 74,000 occurred during the war. France faced the same problem. In 1916, it reported over 31,000 cases, with more than 79,000 in total. Drying feet, changing socks, massaging with oil, improving drainage systems, introducing rubber boots, and building wooden walkways were measures that dramatically reduced the incidence of this condition. During the First World War, danger to soldiers and civilians did not come only from enemy fire positions, but also from much slower and more insidious threats, among them hunger and dehydration. These two factors were especially evident in situations of encirclement, when an army or an entire city was cut off from supplies. Naval blockades, such as those imposed by Britain on the Central Powers, caused massive shortages of food and fertilizers. Prices of basic commodities rose sharply, in some areas several-fold, and the civilian population in particular found itself on the brink of starvation. In Germany, several 100,000 deaths due to malnutrition and related diseases are estimated to have occurred during and shortly after the war. While hunger weakened defenders physically and psychologically, thirst was no less cruel. In besieged fortresses and cities, drinking water often ran out before food, wells could be contaminated, water supplies cut off, and reserves quickly exhausted. Without water, the human body fails far more quickly than without food. When combined with infections that spread more easily in bodies weakened by malnutrition, death by hunger and thirst became a brutal but common reality of trench and siege warfare. And with that, our list of deaths that could befall soldiers on the battlefields of the First World War comes to an end. What other causes of death would you add? Did anything in our selection surprise you? Write to us in the comments.